Abraham Lincoln famously said, "A nation divided cannot long endure." We can survive our divisions if they're handled with civility and respect. Learn some practical advice on how to make our discussions less harsh and more enlightening. Next on Living Smart. Welcome to Living Smart, the show designed to help you get the most out of life. Are you tired of partisan bickering or the polarization in our society along race, socioeconomic groups, religion, or special interest? So is Reverend Cassandra Dunkey. She co-founded the Institute for Civility in Government after she realized many Americans had ceased to communicate with respect. A pastor at the Woodforest Presbyterian Church in Houston, she became concerned with the decline in civil behavior throughout society. Today, she'll explore 10 simple practical steps to help create better relationships with each other. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. Civility. What's the sort of a layman's term description of what civility is?
Well, we define civility as claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading someone else's in the process.
Okay, so how did the Institute get started and why?
Well, I had led legislative conferences to Washington, D.C. for about 7 years along with Tomas Spath, my colleague. And in the midst of doing that, we found that even when people of goodwill wanted to talk about issues that they disagreed about, once they found how fundamentally they disagreed, they weren't sure how to proceed. And then we were just reading the headlines and watching what was happening in general and couldn't find anybody in the country who was addressing the issue of civility at a grassroots level. And so we saw a need.
You saw a need. Now, let's talk about the 10 rules, and it starts with a very interesting one, which is know thyself. Just old stuff, or Shakespearean and philosophical stuff. Know thyself. Why is that so important for civility?
Because you have to know where you're coming from in order to express clearly what it is that you believe. So many times we just glom onto an idea or a position or something, and then it comes time to defend it, and we're not sure exactly how to do that because we don't know how we reached that conclusion ourselves or what fed into that. And so we just say, well, because.
You get emotional, which is what happens when you lack civility. You get emotional and you lose it.
That's right. And you get to a wall in the conversation and in the dialogue. But if you know why you believe something and how you came to that belief and what influenced you, then you have something to go with when you're discussing it with somebody who thinks differently.
And other people understand you better in that sense because you are giving examples of your life experience, which
Absolutely.
A lot of us make decisions as to how we stand on something from our life experiences.
Absolutely.
You have 3 rules on listening. Listening with the heart, listening with strength, listening with the mind. Tell me why listening is so important and how to learn to listen.
Well, learning how to listen is not easy. So many people think that listening is a passive activity, and it's really not. It takes an enormous amount of energy if you're going to do it well. And I think particularly in our culture today where multitasking is so much the norm and people think that that's a good thing to be able to multitask, and in some situations it is, but when it comes to listening, there's nothing like having somebody set aside everything else to pay attention to you, to affirm who you are, to lend credibility to what you're saying, and to make communication clear. And so we did put 3 different rules because there's different aspects of listening, and listening with your strength is just paying attention, turning down the music, setting aside the activities, watching the body language, taking note of what's being said, and listening with your mind is getting the background information so that you're not just taking what they're saying, but asking questions, asking them to back it up, exploring what they're saying. And listening with your heart is being open to change. You know, you can listen to the words and you can get the information, but if you're just doing it just because you have to and you're not open to changing your mind or learning anything, then you've wasted everybody's time to begin with.
Yeah, you're being adamant and you don't want to open up. And you said that listening with your heart is where transformation happens. Tell me about that.
Well, Alan Alda said in his book something along the lines of true listening is being willing to be changed by the other. And I think that's as good a definition of listening as I've ever heard of true listening. It's when we listen to others that we discover who we are and what we believe and why. When we do that with our heart and mind completely, and it opens us to change. As you learn from other people, you start to shift a little bit or expand your beliefs or reaffirm your beliefs.
Right,
I mean,
right.
It's not always about changing. Sometimes it's about reaffirming. But it's that connection between people that we are a relational species. I mean, that's how we are made. That's who we are. And so a major part of that is listening to others.
And also being calm. I think a lot of times we are listening to each other, but we already have our mind made up. I'm not going to listen to this. And there's a certain sense of calmness that you need, it seems, to really listen.
Well, it's about more than just being polite, too. Sometimes people will sit there and wait for somebody else to finish talking, but they're really already forming their own response.
They're thinking the whole time, and they're not listening.
That's right.
True.
They're not really listening. They're just waiting their turn.
Human nature. Let's talk about respect. That's another rule that you have. Very important.
Very important and not always easy, because we're always so sure that our position's right that, how could somebody disagree with us?
Since we're perfect and we know everything. Yes, I know.
Well, at least on this issue, right? At least on this issue. But respect is understanding that other people have life experiences that mean just as much to them as your life experiences mean to you.
Right.
And have formed them just as yours have formed you. And need to be respected. Right. For that reason. They have come to their positions and their understandings and their ideas based on what they've experienced in life, on what they've learned, on what they've been taught, and there's just a possibility that they've heard something you haven't, or that they've learned something you don't know, and so respect them and learn from them.
Right. Now, you said something that I really enjoy this rule, because I think we don't realize this, but one of the rules is help comes from unexpected places and probably unexpected people. Tell me about that, because I think it's very interesting.
Well, help does come from unexpected places, and sometimes from where we least expect it. And some people might frame this word in a little bit different way. They might say an enemy today is an ally tomorrow.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah.
You never know, and it's been said that be nice to people on your way up, because you don't know who you're going to meet on your way down. All those things are kind of related, because you don't know whose help you're going to need in the future for maybe something very small, but maybe some really good, strong effort, and so it's good to stay open and not to build those walls and close those doors, but to keep the communication open so that whoever can jump in and be your ally on a particular cause. Particularly, a good example of this right now is we just finished an election.
Right.
And it was a contentious election, as elections always are. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's how we highlight differences and make choices obvious. And I think a lot of people were surprised, though, when President-elect Obama invited Senator Hillary Clinton to be Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. They had fought and highlighting their differences. Right. And yet here now they can collaborate and be on the same team and work together for various goals.
Well, and that kind of leads to my next question, and that is relationship is everything. That's another rule that you have. Relationships are everything. Tell me about that.
Relationships matter. In your personal life, in work, in school, in government, relationships matter. Some people may get real cynical about this and say, oh, well, it's who you know, isn't it? It's all who you know.
Yes, who you know, yeah.
Well, in a way, yes, it is. Whether you're talking friends or work or government, we rely on the people we know for information and to support us and to help us. You might call it, well, it's networking, isn't it? But it's more than that, too, because the more good relationships we have, the more we learn, the more we can collaborate together, the more possibilities that exist. The more isolated we are, conversely, the less possibility we have for addressing an issue, the less resources we have for coming together and solving a problem. And
That's
so
right.
relationships really do matter.
And in this case, maybe relationships with people you don't agree with.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, that's going to help you in the long run, not only open you up to, in your mind and in your soul, but also help you in the future when you disagree with someone.
Well, but to be able to accomplish a common goal, sometimes in order to, particularly in the governing process, in order to accomplish something, you need to bring people together from a lot of different points of view.
Right.
And while your voice may not be able to be heard by people who think differently, your colleague over here has good relationships with them.
Exactly.
And so if you can work together for that common goal, then you're able to get that critical mass in order to make it happen.
Yeah. And the next one, another rule is trust, 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 which seems to be so difficult in government.
It's hard everywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
let's face it. Trust is hard in life, period. Especially trust once betrayed is extremely difficult to recover. Not impossible, but very difficult. That's why trust is so important. Once you have somebody's trust,
you can get things done.
You can get that done, but you want to honor that trust.
Right.
You don't want to betray it any more than you would want to be betrayed yourself. So many people think that in Washington, money or power are the main coin of the realm. And they play a part. There's no doubt about it. They're part of that dynamic. But trust is really what it comes down to. Who can you trust?
Right. And you said that politicians, what you need to think about is holding them accountable.
Yes.
Not so much the trust, but hold them accountable, follow through.
Yes, of course. We always need to do that.
I'm sorry.
I was just like you would, again, in your own life, you hold people accountable for what they do and what they say.
Whether you trust them or not, just hold them accountable, right? One is powerful. That's another rule. One, the power of one. Tell me about that. We've heard that before.
Absolutely. And, you hear different stories about how one person makes a difference in their community or, in one person's life, you'll say, oh, that one person will never know how much they meant to me.
Right.
And so one person is powerful, but also in the context of government. And people tend to get very apathetic and say, oh, one vote, it's really not going to make a difference, or one more phone call or one more letter. Well, what can I do, know?
Right.
But one person can make a tremendous difference. For one thing, in Washington, and I'm sure in all the state governments as well, or city councils. I mean, it's not just national government. It's government on the school board.
Any government, right.
Any government. They pay attention to who calls and how many people call. They pay attention to how many emails they get. They pay attention to how many letters. They pay attention to who comes to town hall meetings and takes the time.
Yes.
And
squeaky wheel gets the grease.
And pays attention. And so you don't know when your one letter or your one phone call or your one question or plea or whatever it is you're doing is going to be the one that tips the balance.
Right.
That tips the scale.
Do you have examples of that in this experience that you've had?
Well, one of the most profound experiences we've had in this is we were in Washington and meeting with different legislators just to let them know about the Institute and what we do and how we could be a resource and the importance of civility. And there was a congressman who we had approached, and I understand that members of Congress are very, very busy. They have enormous responsibility and so many demands on their time. And so they have to draw the boundaries somewhere. Mm-hmm. They can't do everything or be everything to everybody. And so a lot of them choose not to meet with folks who are not from their congressional district, which makes sense.
Right.
It makes sense.
Not in my neighborhood.
Well, you might have a good cause, but I need to pay attention to my constituents.
Sure,
I need to save my time for that. And we understand that, and that makes sense. However, we were visiting this congressman because we had members of the Institute in his district.
Okay, good.
And so that's why we were going to him. And the initial response we got was, no, we don't do that. We don't have time. Thank you for stopping by, but no thank you.
Right.
And so what we did was we called one of our members in his district and said, could you just call and tell them that you hope that they'll make time to meet with us because you live in the district and you think this is important? And she said, well, I don't think it'll make any difference, but if you want me to, sure. And so she made the call, and it wasn't 5 minutes after she made the call that congressional office called us back and said, we would love to meet with you.
Right, the power of one.
The power of one. And that wasn't, you know, people hear that and again say, oh, well, you know, you can look at any of this very cynically.
Right.
And I beg people not to do that.
Right.
Don't look at it as, oh, well, then they got the call, and so, yeah, they wanted to look good. No, here it is. They heard a concern from a constituent.
Right.
And so then that enabled them to say, oh, this is important to our constituents. Yes, let's listen.
It sounds like you have to stay with it, too. You have to be persistent.
You do.
You know?
Everything in life takes effort that's worthwhile.
Exactly.
It's not easy, and people tend to give up too easily and too quickly, but if you hang in with something,
sooner or later
it will take place.
Okay. Another rule is numbers count. What do you mean by that? Numbers count.
Well, numbers do count, don't they? Whether it's elections or popularity votes at school or whatever it is, numbers count. And that's just the nature of the beast. I mean, that's just how we are. But not just in the context of elections. If you look at our culture and the changes that have taken place in the last 20, 30 years or so many of the things that have fallen out of favor have done so because people came together.
Right.
And they organized. You know,
critical mass.
Critical mass.
Tipping point.
You can look at drunk driving.
Right.
It was Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
That's right.
You can look at smoking, which used to be extremely popular in this country.
Absolutely.
But American Cancer Society and other organizations did education, came together. Right. People donated money and mobilized and made their voices count and said, you know, we want city ordinances that limit smoking in restaurants or whatever. And it became unpopular. That was a huge cultural shift, a change. There's no reason why we couldn't do the same thing with civility. And that's why we've organized for it. And while people say, well, isn't it common sense? Isn't that what you were taught in
the least
school?
common of the senses is common sense.
And, you know, and it's a shame that we have to organize for it, but we do. But the good thing is that when we organize and when we come together, then we can make that shift in the culture.
Right.
And wouldn't it be refreshing if our elections were not negative, but very positive and showed differences, because it was more constructive and more culturally acceptable to not run a negative ad.
Right, exactly.
To run a positive one.
Yeah, it's unacceptable. Can you share some stories of what's worked? You've been doing this for many years. Give me stories of what's worked through the Institute of Civility that you've noticed.
Well, one of the things that we do are congressional student forums on university campuses where we bring together 2 members of Congress, one Republican and one Democrat, not to debate, but to model a collegial dialogue for the students on the university and for the faculty there. And one of the things we have found, we anticipated that this would be a powerful experience for the students. Few of them at that age have really had a chance to engage in civic opportunities, so for many of them it's their first chance.
Sure.
It's a unique opportunity to be able to meet with 2 members of Congress and to have your questions unfiltered. It's just, you know, you just get up to the microphone and you get to ask whatever you want to ask. We don't filter the questions. And to get a response back. And they're always surprised that 2 members of Congress from opposite sides can sit there and agree to disagree or agree to agree. They're more surprised when they agree on some issues, because they always see what's portrayed in the media and so often. And so it's an enlightening opportunity for the students. But what we didn't anticipate is what a difference it makes to the members of Congress who have found that this is a unique opportunity for them to come together and sit side by side and meet with constituents and share their ideas and their views. And there are very, very few opportunities to do that. As far as I know, we're the only organization in the country who brings together members in this way with students. And what they have told us personally is that they can't go and do that and remain unchanged. They take that experience back with them to Washington, not just in the context of that particular relationship then with that member from whom they may have learned something that they had never heard before, but also it makes it harder to lambaste other people on the other side of the aisle.
Right.
And so it fosters respect back in Washington in a way we had not quite anticipated, but for which we're extremely grateful. And they come back to us and say, we want to do this again. We want to do this more often. We want to do this with other members. Our colleagues need to be doing this.
Why did we lose civility in the first place in government? What happened?
Oh, there's a lot of theories about that, and I think that as with most things, it's extremely complex and there's more than one reason. Most people date it back to the early 90s and some shifts in political tactics that took place at that time. Some people cite a change in House rules where it used to be that the 1-minute speeches that members could make honoring a hometown hero or something of that nature used to be at the end of the day. They got moved to the first of the day on the House floor, and the tone changed, so it was less about honoring the hometown heroes than it was about lambasting somebody on the other side. Some people say it's because members don't stay in Washington during the week, and their families don't get to know each other, and their children don't get to know each other as they did back before air travel was the norm.
Oh, so they had more relationships.
They had more relationships. And, if I've stood next to you while our kids are playing baseball or soccer, and we've talked about things just happening in our lives, it's hard to get ugly to you.
It is. It's definitely harder.
Yeah.
Let's talk about if you were to pick one rule. What you have 10 rules.
We have 10 rules.
Do you have one that really, really you feel is the most important?
It's really, really difficult because all the rules are a piece. They're connected, and it's hard to pick out any one, but I think if I had to narrow the focus, shall we say, I would choose the listening with your heart. And I think if you listen with your heart, the other two of your mind and strength will probably come along with it. And the reason I think that's so important is partly because I think that we learn more about ourselves when we listen to others. I think that's how we're shaped. I think that's how we're influenced. I think that's how we become more of who we're meant to be. But it also helps the other do the same, learn about themselves as they express their ideas and their questions and their needs. And I just believe that that's the fundamental building piece for human relationship, is listen to one another.
Now, you're obviously very wise, and even before you started this institute. But what did you learn from this? What surprised you about this whole process, Hugh?
First, that I'm in part of it. This is not something I ever planned on doing, never expected to do, had never started a nonprofit organization or thought that I would. I looked for somebody else around the country who was doing this. I was going to write them a check and get on with my life, but saw a need and felt that I had a reasonable way to approach it that could actually make a difference, so that I wasn't just spinning my wheels or using my energy, but could really impact the situation. What has surprised me has been the moments of grace along the journey. What has surprised me is how hard it is. It's not easy, but it's worth it.
How do you know you're living smart?
When I live with civility, they say what goes around comes around, And when you live with civility, you make life easier for everybody. This is a button we pass out that says civility is catching, pass it on.
I'm going to do my best to pass it on.
And you know, when you do that, it just makes life easier, more pleasant, and more creative for everyone.
Thank you so much, Reverend Cassandra Dunkey, for joining us, and hopefully we'll become more civil in time.
I trust we will. Thank you.
And to learn more about this topic, go to our website. There you'll also find a complete resource list. You can also email us or call us with your comments at 713-743-8513. And that's our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to live smart. I'm Patricia Gras. Have a civil week.
For a transcript of this program, send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.